Very well. Well, Dr. Knutson, thank you so much for joining me. This is CK Black Group's Reflections and Notions in Cannabis pod series. And this is episode 6 for us. And for those of you who have been watching our previous work and you enjoy it, please put a like by this, or if you haven't yet, maybe subscribe so you'll get a notification when we come up with new content, which is, we're trying to do it on a bi-weekly level. But thank you for being here. And so let's just get right to it. I'd like to introduce Dr. Kathy Knutson. Kathy is a microbiologist, an expert in micro and in food safety and HACCP program. She's an instructor for PCQI certification, which is a FSMA requirement relative to food safety, and she'll talk about that a little bit. And I've had the privilege of working with Kathy through our interactions relative to NCIA, which is the National Cannabis Industry Association, where Kathy is on the board of their education committee. And we can talk about that a little bit further, but she's a very busy, very active, and very well respected in the field of safety, and particularly taking the elements of food safety into the world of cannabis, which many facilities have need for that kind of information in that. So perhaps you can summarize that more eloquently than I, Kathy, but please tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of your thoughts about what I've talked about so far.
Sure. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you for inviting me. I'm super excited to be here on the podcast with you. So that was very good. My education is microbiology followed by food science. And a lot of people in the cannabis industry don't even understand that food science exists. And it is not nutrition, it is the processing, packaging, manufacturing of food. And so I've been able to transfer my skill set from the food industry and apply it to the cannabis industry. And at first, I thought that I would just be working with edibles, but it really goes back to cultivation. And if you think about farm to fork in the food industry, that starts with agriculture and the growing of a crop or raising of an animal. And we have that exact same concept in the cannabis industry with seed to sale. And so it starts with cultivation. And so I've been doing work throughout that whole continuum of cultivation through packaging and getting the products ready for sale in a dispensary. I just came back from Pittsburgh. I delivered talk there in a 3-person symposium. The conference was International Association of Food Protection, and I liken it to a class reunion of food safety geeks. And we all know each other and we see each other every year at this conference and get caught up, and I'm very proud. I was a co-organizer of the symposium. I'm very proud that it was the first in-person symposia at the conference on cannabis. Last year, there was one that, because of the pandemic, all of the speakers and the organizer were all virtual. So I can claim that.
Nice.
Back to my resume now. So I've been trying to bring the good word about the cannabis industry to the food industry, and then bringing the potential future federal regulations under FDA to the cannabis industry. In 2020, I published a book. It is Food Safety Lessons for Cannabis-Infused Edibles. And that was when I was still kind of in that mindset of focusing just on edibles. And now I have much broader scope of what I look at in the cannabis industry.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. And as you were speaking, I came up with a question, and it's kind of out of the blue. Um, Several of my colleagues and I have been working with different state advisory panels relative to the development of regulatory guidelines or licensing guidelines, specifically in the cannabis space. And we've seen multiple states adopt what they call the 2013 FDA Food Code, which is now the 2017 FDA Food Code. And I just learned about that. I'm just asking you off the cuff because I haven't done my homework yet. What
No.
the difference between 21 CFR 117 and that food code? And is there a strategic reason why many of these state legislatures are adopting that as their food safety guideline? I'm interested.
Yeah, the FDA food code is really interesting. It's very well established as a guideline. So at the federal level, it is the FDA guideline, meaning that it doesn't have the full force of a rule. And then states have the ability to either blanket accept the FDA guideline for the food code, or they can take it as basically an outline and then they can tweak it or make it more specific to the industries within their state. So then every state has its own state food code, and the primary audience for the food code is our restaurants and bakeries and other types of operations like that that are selling directly to consumers. And the food code is absolutely designed for food safety. So whenever somebody learns about the food code, there's specific training for the food code in each state, and licensing, so that there's those licensing fees that go to the state. They will learn about time and temperature. So cook temperatures that produce a safe meal, um, chill temperatures when a hot food has to be cooled down rapidly to be held cool so that it's not in that danger zone of 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 140 degrees Fahrenheit for very long. Those are the types of things that are in the food code. And so we see the states. One thing is that the states are very, very familiar with the food code. It's either part of the health department or it's part of the Department of Ag to go out and inspect those restaurants. And so there's that familiarity, and it's a good first step in food safety for the cannabis industry, because right now the cannabis industry is really small in terms of square footage and area. So in the cannabis industry, there we usually call the person who's manufacturing edibles a cannabis chef, because again, we need more food scientists in the cannabis industry. And the area is typically called a cannabis kitchen. And that term grew out of restaurant speak. And it's not a bad place to be. It is just so very, very, very short of what is being implemented in terms of food safety within our manufacturing facilities. So as the cannabis industry grows, the companies will grow in size. They will have larger facilities, and then also with legislation at the federal level, again, looking forward to that, then there will be the FDA rules that the industry will have to come under. Right now, there's current legislation going through Congress, and it is calling for both the FDA to have authority at the federal level and for TTB. And TTB is, I can't remember what it stands for, but is in the Department of Revenue, and that's all about taxation. So it'll be a combination of FDA authority for food safety, for public health. FDA is all about public health, plus that taxation at the federal level as well. But
Interesting.
the food code, yeah, so it's something that the states are familiar with. It's easy to adopt. It's a good first step. Under the food code in most states, there also will be the implementation of HACCP, but that HACCP looks like restaurant HACCP. It doesn't look like food manufacturing HACCP. So again, it's way, way short of
Mhm.
what the finish line looks like for the cannabis
Understood.
industry.
Well,
Yeah.
that gives me some great perspective. In ASTM speak, it sounds like the difference between a guide and a practice relative.
Mm,
Um, it's imperative, the level of imperative. One's recommendational, one's you better do this kind of thing. And that really that way of looking at it really helps. Interesting.
mhm.
Um, we've been working
And
with.
then, sorry, just to interrupt. But then once it's under state code, then it would be required for those cannabis companies.
Understood. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're tasked with helping to create or motivate manufacturers in Colorado to adopt a more stringent sort of GMP approach. And that we've been struggling for years. And the idea people want is, to enforce the entire complexity of GMP on all 1,000 manufacturers in Colorado. I would say 80% could not afford to do that, even if they wanted to, given the nature of the complexity and the lack of, say, quality administration within their organizations or resources to deploy in the way that one would expect. And so we've kind of adopted, we're trying to sell actually right now a different approach where we have a phase of development, and that phase is gradational. And we put together an assessment, a literal online cloud-based assessment with about 120 questions that gets right down to essentially functional common sense sanitation activities. Because really, the end objective is make sure that this product is safe for human consumption. And so if we food safety, well, the first thing you got to do is you got to make sure everything's clean, right? That we have sanitation. That's sort of the driving factor, and then an infrastructure to be able to support that through documentation and that. We're not even going with the documents first. We're
Right.
actually creating, do you wipe your food surface contact areas once a day or once a shift, or what is whatever those questions may be. And then they're not going to have to hire a third party auditor or have the state come in and audit. They'll get a copy of this assessment and they'll do a self-assessment. And that'll be record, and it'll be very clear. Look, you need to be honest with this, because if you're not, and something goes south with one of your products, you will be accountable for not being truthful with this, right? So there's this idea, but the intrinsic idea is that the manufacturers can use their own creative resources and not have to hire consultants or hire expensive auditors for a full-blown, and I know that that's counter to what our business objectives are in general. However, I do believe that the more entities that we can save and move into higher levels of complexity will be butter for our bread down the road, I think. Are looking thing. And so we're doing that. We've got 3 different phases. The first phase is just this sort of generic common sense sanitation assessment. They go online, they fill out the survey, it gets dumped into the cloud, and kept by the state. And then their aspiration, maybe that'll be what we're going to call silver level. Now they got to do the gold level after a certain time. Well, that's now putting in supporting documents that support those elements that they're practicing. Write them down, write an SOP, and then finally down at the end game, perhaps compliance to 21 CFR 117. But by working through that gradationally with their own resources, they're going to be learning it, and then they're going to be implementing it. So when it comes down to the final push to GMP, they're likely going to have a lot of their ducks in a row already, and it's not going to be such a huge shift, if you will, and maybe easy to accommodate. Anyway, I wanted to share that strategy with you because Ed and I seem to have convinced Colorado that at least the advisory panel that might be a pretty good approach, and we seem to have about an 80% agreement. So now it's just putting it together and seeing what the state wants to do with it. But I'm just curious as to what your thoughts on that strategy are. Does it make sense, or are there other elements you think we might want to put into play relative to that objective?
Yeah, a couple of things. The first thing is that with most of the facilities looking at the potential of GMPs, and GMPs should be required across the United States. That just needs to be a given at some point. But when you are first starting up, first of all, the cannabis industry just doesn't have enough people. No company has anybody sitting around wondering what they're supposed to be doing. Most of the people at a facility are wearing multiple hats. And so then they have to wedge this in to their work,
Right.
along with all their other work. But if a cannabis industry were to look at the full scope of what GMPs covers, it would be absolutely overwhelming. Nobody wants to look at all of that. And so doing it in a step-by-step fashion, for example, that first step that you're talking about, where you don't even have an emphasis on documentation, that is perfect because you want the company to go, you want the company to be successful, and you want the company at every step along the way to feel like they're building this program and that we do have this end goal of being GMP compliant. So I think that's perfect. The other thing is that in the way that I look at GMPs, they're it's a double-edged sword. There's two sides, or two sides of the coin. How many different scenarios can I do there? Because one side of the coin is that GMPs, uh, in many cases, do not require documentation. That um, the record keeping is just not as stringent compared to 21 CFR 117, which is all about documentation and making sure that you've got everything documented there. But when you're going through GMPs, when I'm working with a client, I'm not as concerned about documentation or record keeping compared to, are you just doing the right thing? Do you have everything in
Mhm.
place? Do your people follow procedures that you've created in your facility? And one of the things that's really hard about GMPs is that it's not prescriptive. And so everybody has to kind of reinvent the wheel at their own facility and figure out, in terms of like sanitation, this is what we do here. This is the company that we buy our chemicals from. This is where we store them. This is how we dilute them. This is how we use them. And it's all about figuring out, this is what we do here. And then you create those SOPs, which more and more, which seem a little daunting to companies. When you start talking about writing SOPs, it can be very difficult. I had a client last summer where we had to write out the procedure for cleaning. This was a food company, so it was just one room, one portion of the production line. And so the supervisor had pen and paper while the sanitation crew member did the work. And he just wrote down step by step by step what that person was observed to be doing. And sometimes you have to start with that Don't even ask your sanitation person to write down the procedure when they're focusing on their work. And it's a very, very important job, but bring in somebody else who can just write the steps down. I like using that with my clients. And then the second thing with SOPs is I like calling them training documents,
Mhm.
because once you have those procedures written down, and especially in the cannabis industry where there's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of very, very fast growth for companies, you can at that point, once the SOP is written, have that as a first step for learning how to do the procedure. So it really becomes a tool, a training tool. And I like to focus on that, rather than, okay, these are the steps that we follow.
Well, and then you can also think of that in terms of the specifics of 21 CFR 117 and 111. You're also getting two birds stoned at once, right? Because your training tool now has to be reviewed by the people that are implementing it, and likely it's not signed off on it. So you're generating training records and creating a system for a qualification of understanding. So we do use the phrase getting two birds stoned at once, as it were. But
I love that.
I like that. I like that idea of thinking about SOPs as a training tool. I've created a library of what I'm calling the critical GMP administrative SOPs templates that I provide my clients just as part of my services to them. And then encourage them to go tweak them and individualize them to the specific elements of their processes, their company, that kind of thing. But I have found that strategy works really well in helping to mitigate the complexities, because they're here. Here's the template. Go fill in the blanks, and you got an SOP kind of thing. And it's important, and that documentation is important.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. That is a huge service. And to be able to have something to start with so that you just have to edit it and make it your own is beautiful. I love that.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. My first consulting started in Canada, and that was all European Union um, type documentation, which is a little more extensive than the 21 CFRs. There are a lot of really valuable documents that really help support your system if you take the extra effort up front to set those up. And
Mm-hmm.
master site document, all the information relative to your site, its location, and the codes that you're operating under, and how that maybe translates to more finite GMP related approaches. It's kind of interesting. And but yeah, that's a really, really important element. So I'm gonna have to get together with you at some point and share some of this online auditing software that we've come up with. I think you'll really get a kick out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Was it?
Yeah, a lot of the work that I do is gap assessment. So going back to the GMPs, when I go boots on the ground at a facility, um, almost right away, certainly one of the first things that we do is we walk the perimeter of the building, and I look at the grounds and I look at the outside structures, downspouts, the dumpsters that are outside, neighbors, because a lot of these facilities are physically attached with their building to another manufacturing site or some other type of business. And then, if I can, I will get up on the roof and go look at the air handling units. If they're on the
Mhm.
roof, most of them are on the roof. Um, and then walk the inside of the building, paying very close attention to the doors, the bays, any place where there's ingress, looking for holes in the wall, that kind of thing. And that speaks to the GMP category or subcategory within GMPs, which is plant and grounds. And we have layered on top of that, both in the food industry and the cannabis industry, of course, is security. So a lot of those facilities will be completely fenced and have very tight security about getting into the facility itself. And that has been something that I've really had to learn about in the cannabis industry because of the application or implementation of fencing and security measures. It's like security on steroids compared to what the food industry does. In the food industry, if it's a large facility, there may be a guard gate that you stop at and you know, do your signing in at the guard gate. I think in recent memory, in terms of food facilities, there's only been one food facility that was gated, and it was in a large city where it was primarily in a very industrial area, and it was to keep people out so that they're not wandering onto the manufacturing site. Um, so so it's interesting that the cannabis industry has so much security, and then the cameras. So in the on the food side, you mentioned FSMA, and under FSMA, there's what we call the food defense rule, and so
Mhm.
that's a requirement of food companies. However, it is food companies that are making an annual revenue of a minimum of $10 million. So minimum of $10 million in annual revenue. They must have a food defense rule implemented, their steps implemented for food defense. And a lot of companies have put in camera systems like
Mhm.
what we see in cannabis facilities. But in cannabis facilities, there's no dead spots, there's no dead areas, and the food industry isn't to that point yet. They do cameras on the walk areas, traffic patterns, and they do cameras on places where either the ingredients or the food manufacturing um, could be opened up and could someone could have access to it
Mhm.
to put an agent into the food area. But there's a lot of dead spots still. They haven't figured out cost effectiveness on getting everything under camera yet.
Understood. Yeah, that kind of brings back some memories of. I used to run the quality control laboratory at the Domino Sugar Refinery outside of Chalmette, Louisiana. The second biggest sugar refinery in the world, actually. We refined about 8 million pounds of sugar a day in a 24-hour period, um, with about 2,000 different SKUs of products, all of which required a certificate of analysis from my lab. So as you can imagine, it was a very, very busy lab, lots of people doing lots of analyses 24/7. But we also got a lot of our sugar from barges, and that's the dock that runs along the Mississippi River, but it's an international trade area. So we operated under the flag of what they call MARSEC, which is a security classification by the Department of Homeland Security. And when our country was experiencing high color alerts, you know, we often had National Guard guys running up and down the dock with their automatic weapons, and the security was on the outside of that facility. There was no hidden spots. I mean, we had people, you know, trying to smuggle themselves into the United States by hiding in a sugar barge and then climbing out at night as prior to. Anyways, that rang a bell. Certainly, that's more of a human kind of security thing, not a food protection kind of security or food defense thing. But I think the same idea applies. It was pretty interesting. We had to jump through some hoops sometimes just to go to work and get through the gate.
That's
But
okay.
I
At least they're
agree.
doing their job.
And the other part that I wanted to talk about relative to the cannabis industry is, I know that in my approaches with consulting, I'm, through my own company and also in my work with Andrew at Orion, um, the idea of teaching the client risk assessment and really starting from that platform and letting that drive their perspective. I just took out a work item for ASTM D37 where I'll be putting together a standard for risk assessment in cannabis. And, so that I'll probably shoot you some drafts and ask your comments relative to it. But I think that's a pretty important element. And a lot of the things we're doing in ASTM and D37 is really to create standards that basically replicate those dozen primary administrative GMP standards that speak to change control, document control, standard operating procedures, deviations, CAPA, recall, um, auditing, and all those elements to try to create that library in the form of ASTM standards. This risk assessment standard will be another addition to that library. And I didn't know if you knew that we at ASTM that we were working on that or had been.
It wasn't on my radar, so I'm glad you put it on my radar. I'm very interested in that. I have some pretty strong opinions about risk assessment, and in both HACCP and the food safety plan, you have to start with a hazard analysis.
Right.
And we're in a very tight spot here in the cannabis industry. Um, two two things that we don't have going for us is that there is a lot of product testing, a lot of finished product testing at every step along the way. So a cannabis extract is going to be tested before it goes into an edible, and then the edible is going to be tested before it goes out for sale. And let's see, what was the other one? That one. And then not doing the tests based on a risk assessment, but instead doing the tests which are in the state code. So the state code is requiring the chemistry and micro tests. And of course, in order to operate within a state, the cannabis company must meet those requirements. But that's not what we do in the food industry, and that's not what we do under FDA. Under FDA, it is all about risk assessment, do your hazard analysis of your inputs, so the cannabis extract going into an edible and all the other ingredients, whether it's a processing aid like a pan spray or whether it is an ingredient that's going to be labeled as on the ingredient listing, the hazard analysis has to be done on each one of those ingredients. And because of that hazard analysis, we can identify appropriate hazards based on science. So we
Exactly.
need so much more information, which is another reason why we need legalization of cannabis so that our wonderful universities can do that type of research. At the end of the symposium, or after one of the speakers at the symposium that I was just participating in, there was a big question about shelf life of cannabis infused edibles and the degradation of the cannabinoids over time during that shelf life, and potential chemical reactions, potency, those kinds of things are going to change during shelf life. And we just don't have enough research in that area.
I
We're
agree.
doing so much more on the cultivation side, the extraction side, but it is just common in the food industry to do a shelf life study where at the end of the shelf life, and this is true for dietary supplements as well, whatever is labeled must be present at the end of shelf life. So if you think about a dietary supplement and whatever the active ingredient is, at the end of that shelf life of a dietary supplement, that active ingredient must be present in that concentration that's labeled. In the food
Mhm.
industry, I use the example of cereal, and cereal gets a lot of vitamin fortification. And at the end of shelf life, let's say it's a 1 year shelf life for that box of cereal, every single one of those vitamins must be at or above whatever is labeled on the
Right.
nutrition fact label. And so our cereals are just overloaded with vitamins because
Right.
vitamins will degrade over
Sure.
time. And in order to be legal, they have to be at that concentration that's labeled. So
Understood.
that is something that we need a lot of information, a lot of research in that area to answer
There
those.
is, yeah. And there's a lot of opportunities there. And from that point, I wanted to share with you the Rob Thomas and myself were co-chairing an ASTM symposium for spring, summer of 2023, specifically about contamination mitigation in cannabis. And we've split it into three, what we call the primary areas of concern. The first being pesticides, insecticides, those kind of external chemicals. Next one being microbials, and then the last one being heavy metals. And we're going to focus on those three contaminants. We feel those are probably the heavy hitters. And we need someone to help us put together the microbial side of that symposium. So I suspect you might be getting a phone call here before too long. And
Yes, and I have another colleague that would be excellent for you that I can connect you with, um, which I got connected. I am working with a group in Maine to influence legislation there, and so we have a couple of us have worked through our thoughts on microbial testing and microbial limits. Um, and again, I have a lot to say about that.
nice. We'll have to have that conversation. I really have high hopes for this symposium. Right now, we're in a process of negotiation, but it looks like we'll be sharing the spotlight with Analytical Cannabis, who's going to use their global distribution. We literally could have thousands of people participating in the symposium.
That's
And we
awesome.
really need it. The industry really needs this
The
contaminant.
state, the states really need it because there's a lot of state required testing and limits that, in my humble opinion, with what I know about the cannabis industry, are just unreasonable.
Mhm,
So the big example is yeast and mold count. It is totally reasonable that plant material would have yeast and mold on it.
mhm.
And it's not, for the most part, is not harmful. And we need a lot of education in that area to the industry.
There's I'll send it to you, a recent paper by Nandu and his colleagues at United States Pharmacopoeia. And they actually give recommendations for acceptable limits of various contaminants. And really the limits they have associated with yeasts and molds are on the order of 10,000, 100,000 CFUs. So pretty liberal in what they're allowing, although they get more specific for the aspergillus and those kind of things for obvious reasons.
Pathogens, yes.
At any rate, I'm going to send that to you. I think we've got a good half hour of conversation here, and so I think I'm going to conclude the discussion. Though I have to say that it seems like there should be more discussions down the road. This is pretty fascinating, and I can see how your perspective may add a lot of value to a lot of people in the cannabis industry. So hopefully we can get them to listen to the
Yeah,
podcast.
I'll keep talking.
But no, I very much appreciate your time. And with that, I'm going to conclude the recording and thank you very much for coming and sharing your thoughts. And I very much enjoyed our conversation.